This is the Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Borderonay. The two of us are architects, partners at the office, and of course, hosts of the show. And today our guest is Thomas Woltz.
Thomas is the senior principal and owner of Nelson Byrd Woltz Landscape Architects. They have an office in New York City and Virginia.
Yes, and this recording was a little bit shorter than usual, but we packed in
a lot of
stuff into the hour. Which I was amazed. You guys are going to love this recording. We talked about landscape architecture, of course, how he was first introduced to that, and how his childhood home and place where he grew up impacted him in that way. We talk about storytelling, their approach to landscape architecture design, which is heavily research-based. And I don't know. We just talk about a lot of really interesting things.
And for any architects listening to this, I think you also are going to regret getting into just architecture and want to convert to landscape architecture.
Well, so his background, as you hear, is architecture and landscape, and then he now is a landscape architect. So we talk about the differences between the two, why he pivoted, and all that kind of stuff. They also have a new monograph that's out, and we'll put the link of that in our show notes. And it is called The Land is Full, so make sure to check it out. Sponsors.
One of the best tools we found for specification and project management is Programma, an outstanding all-in-one suite designed specifically for interior designers. With Programma, you can create schedules, mood boards, and invoices and share all your project information with contractors and clients through the convenient client dashboard. Projects can get complicated, but Programma simplifies everything, saving you time so you can focus on design. Start thriving with Programma by tapping the link in our episode notes and use the code Second Studio to save 25% on your annual subscription. Would you like to get Asbirds faster?
Yes.
Okay. IPX has you covered. IPX lets you seamlessly transform laser scans into LOD 300 BIM and CAD files. Whether you've got your 3D scans already or need the full laser scanning service, IPX offers instant pricing and order tracking for scan-to-BIM services on any project, no matter the size or complexity. Once a building scan is complete, IPX delivers detailed BIM, CAD, 360 virtual tours, and material takeoffs in their platform, where you can view, share, export, query, and quantify areas, floors, and materials. Check out the IPX link in our show notes.
This is the Second Studio with myself, Marina, and our guest, Thomas. Here we go.
I grew up in Mount Airy, North Carolina, at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains on a 500-acre cattle and tobacco farm that had belonged to several generations of my father's family. Interestingly, my mother also grew up from a many-generational farming family with the same land since the 1700s in western North Carolina as well, just farther west. And when my parents got married, they built a small house in the 1940s right next to my grandfather's house. Wow. And my uncle and aunt built on the other side. So I would say growing up on large-scale working land in this incredible context of the Blue Ridge Mountains, much later I came to realize that was a major influence on why I became a landscape architect.
That's a very, very specific place to grow up.
I mean, I'm a total sandbox kid and an Eagle Scout, which was also a very important part of my growing up time, camping, hiking, being in the woods. There was a place on the farm where my older brother and I could camp, and it was quite far away, but it was on a high hill in the distance, and my parents from their bed could look really far away, and they could see our campfire. So they knew that we were okay as long as there was fire. I don't know if today's parents would feel that way. Yeah. But it was a very special place to grow up. There's a dark side in that when I was young in middle school, I guess, the farm was turned into a golf course. And so I watched as the beautifully rich stream banks were stripped to be open creeks and fairways and greens and chemicals and grading and drainage. And I think knowing the farm in its richness and beauty, seeing it destroyed, in my mind destroyed, I think everybody else was thrilled. My grandfather built it. So I think he hired the golf course designers from the Disney courses in Florida to come up and do the project. Wow. I think I was so upset seeing blackberry bushes that we'd picked and yeah, seeing this very alive place turn into what even to a young mind looked like a dead place. That many years later, definitely returned to me as a reason for committing my life to the preservation and conservation of biodiversity, and in particular the public landscape.
I mean, I can certainly try and understand how that would leave a lasting mark on someone of that age. That's a 180 also. That's not like from the what it was before to something slightly different to being a golf course with putting greens is.
But David, it's what's happening to our world everywhere we turn. It's being gobbled up, privatized, and chemically dependent. So those are all things that in my work at least, I push against.
So you said your first interest was architecture, and is that something that you realized when in high school? And then did you study architecture in your graduate school?
I did. Like I said, from the sandbox forward, I probably expressed a keen interest in architecture around 7 or 8 years old. And my parents really nurtured that in the sense that we traveled to see a lot of historic sites, a lot of interesting cities. I did undergraduate studies in architecture. I did 2 other degrees while at the University of Virginia simultaneously. I did a degree in architectural history with a focus on humanism and the Italian Renaissance. And then I also did a fine arts degree.
Wow.
And those 3 were basically kind of getting back to the way architecture used to be taught, perhaps. I had wonderful guidance from a Dutch architecture professor, Theo van Grol, who was the dean of students at the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. And he said, why not? Like, add in the arts and sculpture and painting and printmaking and history. Just go for it. And so I really did. And 3 degrees later, I moved to Venice, Italy, and I practiced architecture at a firm there I came back to the States after 5 years in Italy.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, so you, okay.
Oh, I really went for architecture. Yeah. I'm not kidding.
Okay.
And then I did a master's of architecture when I came back to the States, followed by a master's of landscape architecture. And ever since that moment, I have not looked back.
Yeah. So your master's in architecture, was that also at the University of Virginia? Is that right?
Correct.
So
Correct.
What led you, and actually this is a question we get asked often by our listeners, especially younger ones. So what led you to get a master's in architecture?
I think after 5 years in Venice, and I had worked part-time for a professor in his architecture firm during my undergraduate years. I stayed for a 5th year to finish the degree, so I worked part-time for him. So I gathered a good deal of experience. I had my IDP. The only thing remaining to sit for the licensure exam was the master's in architecture. And I'd vested so much time to that point that I thought, well, of course, this is just the logical next step. And I had realized, though, in Venice, and this is a very important pivot for deciding to go back to graduate school, I had realized in Venice a tremendous epiphany. I had always thought the landscape was meadows, forests, fields, gardens, the things that everybody, I think the whole world thinks are landscape.
Yeah.
And suddenly living in a city without streets, but rather canals, without cars, but rather boats, without forests, rather masts of ships. I don't know what the analogy is to forests in Venice, really, but a completely hard-edged city. And that I was having fantastic landscape experiences all day, every day, sitting in the campo or the piazza, looking at the way light and sound, color bounces around in that city. The spaces made by buildings were landscapes. The pavement, the quality of the pavement, the detailing of the pavement, that was a landscape. And the more ephemeral qualities of echo, light, water, the sounds of the city, those were all landscapes. And I finally realized that designing the landscape is actually a highly artistic and abstract activity where you are designing the human experience in the out of doors. And I thought, oh my gosh, that is so subtle and elegant and poetic and changes with the seasons and changes with the hours of the days, whereas a building is remarkably static. And so I came into the University of Virginia with this curiosity and immediately registered for courses in the landscape architecture department. And I met Warren Byrd, who was a professor of plants and the environment, so a horticulture professor. He taught drawing, and he taught design studio and landscape architecture. So I immediately signed up for his studio, and that is the Byrd of Nelson Byrd Woltz. That's the person I eventually went to work for, and that we built this practice together. So understanding the abstract nature of what landscape could be, but then the pragmatics of how to design and build with landscape, married to start to build a passion. Then the third factor I would say is that it was a moment when William McDonough had become the dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia, and he was putting forward a tremendous agenda and a challenge of sustainability and green design. And I came to also see in that moment, in that context, that landscape architecture is putting so much richness in the world. It is a fecund conversation. It's a fertile conversation. It is, biodiversity, and it was just rich, and the impact you could have with a landscape was so big. And the conversation in parallel in architecture was, I would say, it had a veil of apology. We're going to make the smallest building, the smallest footprint, the least energy. We're going to minimize. And I thought, I want the big fecund conversation. I like this biodiversity and conservation. So those three factors, I would say, converged to build the platform. And then the technical ability of our practice, or at least for my role in our practice, is in endless thanks to architecture and to my experience in building things. Our landscapes are highly constructed places. And I think of the 50 staff, I think we have 10 people who also have masters in architecture, And so this knowledge of construction is really at the base of our practice.
That is so well said, and I believe in everything you've said. I'll say for myself, my undergraduate degree was in architecture, and I, for whatever reason, naturally became more interested in larger scale questions of, let's say, urban design. Then I went and got a master's in urban design, and in that space, I was rubbing shoulders with landscape architects, truly for the first time. And I say it all the time. In fact, I was saying it to students the other day. I said, in my view, landscape architects in general tend to be much wiser than architects. And it's really unfortunate that landscape architecture is not as well understood for what it truly is. To your point, I think a lot of people, even architects, younger ones, think about the landscape and landscape architecture as picking flowers or something like that. When it's really not that at all. I mean, the perspective that you folks have, landscape architects, is so broad and encompassing and worldly and important that it's kind of a travesty that there aren't more architecture schools that really begin to plant the seeds and have close relationships between those two sides.
I can't express my gratitude for the way you express that enough, because I face it every day professionally.
Really?
It is appalling, the treatment by some architects, the dismissiveness, the why are you even here at this point? We'll talk to you at the end of the building. They really do still think we come in at the very end, as if we were a beautification squad. And they're missing what the profession could actually offer them as incredibly empowering tools of design to make buildings better. I would correct one thing. It's not that landscape architects are smarter. They just think entirely differently. And part of that is a nimbleness of mind, because I feel like landscape architecture is akin to three-dimensional chess, where you have to keep in mind so many different simultaneous layers. It's not just the design of an object, it's the design of a living system. So you might have an ideal state of that living system in mind, but then you have to think about frozen temperatures or boiling hot summer light or humidity. And then you think of storm intensity. And so everything has to be resilient and responsive so that your essential idea remains, but it can withstand untold extremes in all directions. Then you have just the variability of disease and insects and all these things that attack right. living things. And then you have the technical prowess of space making at scale. And I think one of the ways we think differently is understanding scale. So the hydrology of a system, how the space is forming to hold architecture, to create space for human occupation. And then there's this other layer of what is this site? What is every inch of this site contributing to these bigger discourses that are so essential in our world of regaining or protecting biodiversity, wildlife connectivity and habitat, fighting pollution, processing stormwater, cleaning air, shade in heat extremes. It's just so many things to be thinking about at once. And those things are only to a certain degree under your control. So many of them are like holding the reins on a 10-horse team, and you have no idea where those horses are going to go. But you've got to somehow, with a loose grip, hold it all together. So I think it's just a different way of thinking. It's a different scale of thinking, and it's a different time scale as well. Like one of the things that recently occurred to me is I, have hit mid-50, and I won't live to see many of the projects that are on the boards right now that I'm so excited about. I won't live to see them realize the vision.
Wow.
And instead of that causing panic in me, it brought a remarkable sort of meditative calm, an urgency, but with calm of like, oh, this truly is not about me or NBW or my team. This is actually about setting in motion a giant, complex living thing in service to the public, mostly because our work is public parks. And it must live beyond us. The whole point is that it live far, far, far beyond us. So when architects say, oh, we don't want you to put a tree because when we photograph my building for the Pritzker Award, I'm like, are you even kidding me? How can it only be about you as opposed to the thing that you're putting in motion that the world will hold for generations to come?
That's so beautifully said. I think the challenge with that, though, is all the various topics you mentioned, like 20 different things. The time scale factors and the scale factor is so different from what everyone's used to thinking about. And I don't mean just architects, but I think like the general person is not really able to, I wouldn't say they're not able to, but they don't really think beyond like a 10 or 20 year timeline or their own lifetime, let me put it that way. So for anyone to start thinking about having an impact that outlives them by the magnitude of 50 to 100 years, for most folks, that's just not part of their thinking. And I've always felt, maybe taking a tangent here, but with climate change, that's the problem. Like that humans,
you're exactly right.
They almost are designed quite stupidly to not think about, to not understand or grasp what is 100, forgetting the 500-year mark, but 100, 200 years, what does that mean really for us as a species and the planet? And we just don't think that way. And
most people don't even think about building lasting, more than the
than
time,
the
more than, the 10, 15 years they're planning to live in it, which then if you push that to, the environment and the topic, it's even beyond their, capabilities in some ways.
I mean, that's maybe why, I think you used the word abstract when you were describing landscape architecture. Maybe that's part of it, maybe that's why it feels abstract sometimes.
I think part of the kind of maybe temporary attention span we get from the public is something I want to artfully and subtly shift. And I think about this a lot, trying to create a meaningful experience for people in the public landscapes that we design, like a meaningful understanding of nature. So we really work to deliver content, information, not turning everything into an exhibit exactly, but helping connect people to what this landscape is doing, what it holds, the stories it tells, how much past is actually beneath their feet, right where they're standing, that this isn't new, that they're standing in a place where history unfolded, wherever they might be. And so connecting them to the functions of ecology, to the cultural history of land, starts to help build a coalition, I believe, I kind of have to believe if I'm going to get through, that this builds a bond between people and place. And if that bond is strong enough, they will care for it. And one of the things that haunts me is the lack of understanding of what a public landscape requires in maintenance. We defer maintenance all the time. Projects are overrun. We see this happen where it'll be beautifully designed, implemented, celebrated, ribbons cut, and then 2 years later, overrun with invasive plants or not properly tended, pruned, maintained, and things that they say, oh, it's not working. And it's like, oh, well, your drainage way silted in because a project was built upstream and it filled it with soil. You have to remove that and clean it and replant. So there's a deep chasm in the understanding of what it takes to maintain and sustain a public landscape. So my preamble there about trying to build an emotional bond between people and place is that we have to have stewards who stand up and say to their city council, you cannot, once again, cut the funding for maintaining our public park system. No, we have to stand up for the care of the natural world. And so it's just one of the tools to try to help get support for maintenance. It's not a real sexy topic. Very easy to very easy to criticize. But I think if someone's like, oh, when I was a child, this was actually an open body of water and now it's choked with Phragmites. Oh, maybe there's something going on here that we should get together and do something about. So I know America is built on public-private partnerships, it seems, and that's what it is requiring. So most of our projects are done in partnership with a conservancy that raises private funds for this exact purpose, for maintenance and ongoing care of the site.
The maintenance topic is very interesting, and that's, you know, it's kind of like a topic that, you know, even within architecture, once the building is done and you move in, like, that's it, you know, good luck and have fun the next 20 years. You know, and some firms sometimes, you know, kind of like give, or contractors give kind of like, you know, continued, they give manuals, but also like maintenance. They have a team that comes in and fix things periodically just to make sure the building stays healthy and in good shape for years to come, right? Is that typically a service, or is there some sort of guidelines when you guys work on your projects that kind of guide the team that is going to be doing the maintenance, or how does
Absolutely.
It work?
Yeah, it's one of the services that we provide, and we encourage people to engage us to design a maintenance manual for the landscape, and it covers all kinds of issues. Like, for example, just in the horticultural aspect, which again is one aspect of what we do between grading, drainage, stormwater, terracing, walls, you know, the horticultural piece is the one that seems to really elude people. People can see if there are cracks in the pavement, but they just, particularly if you're watching horticulture grow over years and you're there frequently, you don't notice that something might be out of control. The other thing is that you just by definition plant small trees because you can't plant giant mature trees. So the sun conditions on horticulture are very, very different day one than 10 years later. So you have to redesign it. So you will have presumably full sun at some stage, and then you'll end up with part or full shade eventually. And so that's when a perennial garden, it has not failed. It is just a new ecological context. And so it must be redesigned and reimagined. People just don't want things to change. Yeah. It's very funny. The 1,000 silly stories about, like, oh my gosh, this tree grew. It's like, right.
It's a real tree, so yeah.
It's your tree grew. And now a quick break to thank the sponsors who support the second studio. Revit users, you have access to a powerful new capability you might not know about. Available with Revit version 2023.1 onward, Autodesk Insight is a next-generation carbon analysis tool that can help you make the leap toward low-carbon design. With only a few clicks, Insight lets you analyze, understand, and track the embodied and operational carbon impact of your design choices. You can then visualize opportunities for energy efficiency and carbon mitigation with its flexible dashboards, helping you make more sustainable and informed decisions. Check out the Insight link in our show notes to learn more. This episode of The Second Studio is brought to you by BQE Core, the all-in-one firm management software built for architects. Designed by architects for architects, Core helps you track time effortlessly, manage projects seamlessly, and get paid faster, so you can focus on design, not spreadsheets. With powerful automation and real-time insights, it's everything you need to run a smarter and more profitable firm. See how BQE Core can transform your practice by clicking the link in our show notes. I want to talk about the private spaces versus public spaces, because as you said, you guys mostly work on public places and spaces and parks and whatnot, and also specifically the privatization of public space or privately owned, quote, public space, and why that relationship between the private and public is problematic. And why is it problematic in your view? Why does having privately owned public spaces produce problems? What are the challenges with that?
I think I have examples in both directions where privately owned public space, to me, is truly a problem. Because what I think that implies, and I'm thinking of urban privately owned public spaces, I assume you were too, David, is that is a transactional result of a developer wanting greater. They want to bend the rules or break the rules entirely. And they say, let me break the rule. Give me 5 more stories, and I will give you this 30 feet off the sidewalk. Well, that 30 feet off the sidewalk, in my hypothetical example, is essentially a lobby to their building. So is it really public? Are you allowed to behave in whatever way you wish? No. No is the answer. And it doesn't look public. It doesn't feel public. Like, you may be able to walk through a grand atrium of a skyscraper, but this is not truly the public realm. And I think what is disappointing about that is, why aren't our cities and city leadership saying, we need to build the best possible public realm, and developers can come up around that or contribute to it. But this deal of breaking rules to benefit the developer in order to get a toenail hold of space for the public, it's not good space. It's just not a wise idea, because the results are painfully mediocre. They often feel corporate. They feel like an extension of the lobby of the building, and they're all of different languages. So each one looks like the building or is furnished like the lobby. And so I get very frustrated with public, the POPs as we call them in New York.
Yeah.
I think the positive example of this is the private contributions to public space, and that's the opposite of that. It's the conservancies that I mentioned earlier that raise many millions of dollars to support the care, maintenance, design, even the purchase and creation of truly public space. But that land is owned by the city. It's held by the city. If everything goes sideways, it remains public space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great description as well. Yeah, you're correct. I was thinking specifically of a few pops or popos or whatever they call them, actually in Manhattan. And it's a funny thing because so I lived in New York for several years, and there's a lot of them, but you'd never know that they were, quote, public spaces because they look, like you said, they look like lobbies. And you're kind of like, am I allowed to go over there? You walk through there and there's a security guard staring at you. You're like, okay, I guess I'm not supposed to be here. It's very weird.
Yeah, also, it's like just an extra wide sidewalk, and why would you want to be there?
Yeah.
Just build a better building, or a lower building. I don't know.
You also said earlier, I know I'm kind of jumping around, but you were talking about the being sensitive to the work done to a place and kind of reading into the place or understanding the history of the place. And one of the questions I had was, well, I guess first would be, how do you do that research? But then also, is it challenging to build a landscape architecture project while also being sensitive to what was there before? And how do you do that? Was there a project perhaps you have in mind that kind of balances that line, well? Because they seem almost to a layperson, they can seem counterintuitive, right? It's like, why not just leave it alone?
What, and then throw in a new building that's built there too, right?
Sure.
Then you have to respond to the site history, and then that new thing that's being created, and the population that's going to come.
Well, David and Marina, you have touched on the very essence of our practice at NBW. So I'm excited to answer this question. How do we do the research? How does that happen? Is that in conflict with the design process, and that it sounds counterintuitive? So I am thrilled to answer this because it's been 25 years of honing exactly the answer to that question, and we're not done. I've still got a long way to go. But one of the joys of having never worked in another landscape architecture firm is that we kind of make it up as we go. What is the firm we want to work in, and what do we believe is the correct process for addressing land, for putting appropriate landscapes in the world? What do we believe in as a mission statement, as a firm, as our values, and how do we apply that process to every project? So one of the things we've done that I think is quite unusual for a landscape architecture firm, I wish it weren't unusual, I wish it were just de rigueur, that this is how you practice. We have hired, over the last 12 years, we have had conservation biologists or restoration ecologists full-time on staff. So these are scientists, some PhD, some graduate school, some undergraduate. But these scientists have the mandate for deeply researching the biodiversity of every site, but not just the existing conditions. What might have been there before? What is a projected ecology that could be there in the future? But also, how did this piece of land form? Let's go back to often the Ice Age, when we're dealing with North America, the northern half of North America. Let's go back to the plates colliding. What stone is it? Why is that stone there? Oh, it's a granite-based stone, so it has more acid in the soil because of the base stone, whereas a limestone from the Pancratonic Sea, let's say in Nashville, Tennessee, has a completely different pH of the soil, and therefore a different plant community, and therefore different settlement patterns, because the karst geology led to different ways of people inhabiting the soil or different building practices. There is so much to discover through the eyes of a restoration ecologist. And when you look back at how did a piece of land actually form, there are so many fascinating clues to the culture that exists today. You find all kinds of answers to the why of a piece of land. In parallel to this group, we have on staff full-time cultural landscape historians. We currently have two fantastic historians, both also trained as landscape architects. And I want to be very clear about that. They both have masters of landscape architecture. One of them has a specialization in landscapes of bondage and enslavement, and one of them a specialization in landscapes, indigenous landscapes. if you're working in North America, you are dealing with one or likely both a landscape of enslavement and an indigenous site. And so beginning with their research, they dig from really time immemorial to today of what has been the dialogue of human beings with land on your site. So we now contractually, this is the first phase of an engagement of NBW. We call it pre-design services, to make the point that we're thrilled you've hired us, we're excited to start your project, but until we know this piece of land, we can't start designing. We actually, as an act of grace, must ask the land its story. And only then do we know how to artfully design within that story. So we combine this ecological and cultural research. One of the most exciting days in the office is when we all sit down together and everyone's reporting out on what they've discovered. And there are these just epiphanies of like, oh, that's why the settlers moved to that side of the river. Of course, it was the flood of 1720 that caused this. So you just start to realize, oh my gosh, we know this place. Then you add the brief of the client, the requirements, whether it's a campus for a school or a museum or a sculpture garden or a working farm or a public park. You then layer in that program. It's you know where to put things. You know where things belong and don't belong. You know the why of this piece of land. And the design becomes an incredibly artful weaving of the program into the ecological and cultural context of site. And I think the dedication to this as our design process, a research-driven design process, means that no two parks look alike. Each is in its own way a portrait of place. I think this is the tool that is most powerful in building an emotional connection between people and place. They come to a place for a campus, a public park, or a museum experience, and they learn what is beneath their feet and what has been beneath their feet for thousands of years. It connects us to the land in a way like nothing else I can think of. And I think that's why we've committed to this very flexible, every project is a completely different little ecosystem. It's a very flexible idea, but it is strong enough that we recognize it as our commitment to a process of design.
That's wonderful. That sounds like you're creating a super studio, or you have created it. It would be fun to be part of it.
It might be a kind of super studio. I tell you, it came at great financial risk. Because no one wants to pay for these things, and then so you do it pro bono over and over and over, and then people hire you saying, "Oh, I love that project." It's like, you know how that project came to be?
Yeah,
that project came to be because we invested 2 months, 3 months doing biological surveys, and we found, original letters and deeds and stories and all this. And they're like, ooh, we want that. I'm like, great, this is what it costs. And so now, all these years later, people call and say, we want to hire you for your research-driven process. So we're finally there. People are like, oh, your firm's done pretty well. Are you going to retire soon? I'm like, are you kidding me?
I was just started.
We just got here. We just got here. And the greatest people call us. I have to say, I am so grateful every single day by who calls and who reaches out. Because I've got to say, if they care enough to engage a landscape architect already, that's kind of a miracle.
Right.
2 is if they care enough about their land to want to know its story, and 3, if they're willing to let that guide their project more than parking counts or whatever it might be, then you're dealing with a highly enlightened individual.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I have to say, the people that we work with around the world who have chosen to lead projects like what we get hired to do, they are such good human beings.
Yeah.
I mean, people who've dedicated their life to public parks or the public realm are really remarkably loving, kind people. So we are, for the most part, surrounded by remarkable, extraordinary advocates for this work. But I will say, I do feel like we only just got here, but the right people call us, and we get to work with across the board kindred spirits.
That's tremendous. Actually, my next question was going to be to ask if you ever have, I guess, basically a client whose mission and goals and agenda and program is not quite aligned with everything you described, and how does that conversation go? I guess over the years, those people get filtered out naturally, but maybe currently still happens, or in the past, like how does that happen, or how does that work?
I tell you, a developer putting 500 units in a fragile ecosystem would not even look at our website. They wouldn't even know to call us.
Right.
So fortunately, we don't have that. I have capped the size of the firm about 12 years ago. So I have a zero growth model. Like I don't want to get any bigger. I think we are at 50 people. We can take on gigantic projects and handle them fully professionally. But we're never taking on work to just pay the staff. Now that is again taking a lot of work to get to that point, and it's a luxurious position that could end tomorrow. I'm fully aware of how delicate these things are. But for the last dozen or so years, we are very stable. We only need, at this size, a few projects a year, so we can be, I don't want to sound arrogant at all, but we can be remarkably selective about which projects we want to pursue and not pursue. And it's not because they're the big budget ones. We pursue the difficult, complex, interesting projects that may in fact not be able to really pay us very well. And so we're able to build a suite of projects that are the ones that we care a lot about, and people who really want our process. So we don't have that conflict of someone fighting us about what it is they've hired us to do. I think not being in the developer world, that's pretty good, because I mean, that's where I think that conflict is very real for designers and patrons.
Yeah. Has there been a project to date that was the most difficult? Or if not the most difficult, like what is one of the ones that comes to mind when you think of a challenging project?
I think the biggest challenges to the work, in my experience, are the time it takes to build trust with communities and stakeholders, and sometimes even part of the client group or part of the team. Architecture sometimes is kind of hard to get on the same page with. I just had a very disturbing call from an architect who said, "I'm starting to get the impression that you think you're citing the building." And I said, "Well, that's what we were hired to do." And I said, "I realize this is a shock for you, but that's why we were brought on." So, it's still, it makes it hard. And I think, and so that takes time to get there. And what I don't mind about that is we have to constantly over and over and over prove that we know what we're doing, or prove that we have good creative problem-solving ideas, or prove that our goodwill continues. So it's not a bad exercise to constantly have to prove yourself and to be doubted at every turn. But so often we come into communities, they have a large park that, let's say, is underutilized or derelict or has been hit by drought or floods. And we're coming into their community from outside. And you go to your first public meeting and they're like, "Don't touch a thing." And you can't really say, your park is really in rough shape. You have to and so you go back again and again, and there are lots of public meetings. And what I've learned in that is, do not go to a giant public meeting and say, "What do you want your public space to be?" That's an unfair question, and it's only going to end in heartache. what we try to do is engage in our own internal research process and say, at those public meetings, we are here to hear about your views on this public space, but we'd love to just update you on what we're learning. And people are like, what you're learning? Like we're here to tell you what. And we're like, well, actually, we just did a little research and we found out this, and we found out this, and we found out this. And you do, graphics of like a timeline of their town, a timeline of how the park came to be, why the park came to be. Questions that today's public rarely ask themselves, but they're at the heart of how we think and design. And so when you go in with a gift, an offering that demonstrates your deep curiosity about their land, their city, their community, people are like, huh, we didn't know that, or that's interesting. And in one case, we had a 1 year of public input on a project in Houston, Texas. And the first public meetings were so angry and contentious, and I thought, we're here talking about a spectacular public park. Why is everybody mad? I just couldn't figure it out. And I think there had been a lot of suffering. That park had gone through 4 years of drought, and 80% of its forest canopy had died.
Oh, wow.
And it's Memorial Park in Houston. It's twice the size of Central Park. So it was a horrific loss for this community. And suddenly somebody from New York City showing up to tell them what their park is going to be. And it was angry. Yeah. It was really a lot of angry vibe. And so we started with this timeline, starting with the Karankawa people of Gulf Coast indigenous people. And I think just Houston thinking of itself as a Gulf Coast city was sort of an epiphany. And by a few months later, we had people coming to the meeting saying, I didn't know about you at first, but we came to this meeting because we wanted to hear the next chapter. We wanted to learn the next chapter of your research. We've become so interested in what this piece of land is about. We just thought it was woods that didn't get built on. We had no idea it was a training camp for World War I soldiers, one of the earliest patents for westward expansion of the Reinerman family. It was brick kilns and a timber operation and cattle grazing. And, Spanish had come through this particular site. And we even found ash, layers of ash that were just a few millimeters apart, down at what our soil scientists said was about 400 years ago. So we could see that the Karankawa had burned this park to attract bison.
Wow.
400 years ago. So people were just suddenly like, oh, maybe this guy from out of town is actually really interested in our place, and we're going to learn about our own land. And it's been a really positive experience. But I tell you, the time it takes to get to a good, healthy place is a tremendous investment. So it's not a problem with projects, but I think all of that is entangled with our lack of understanding of nature, our lack of understanding of the stories of our land, our disconnect with the continuum of land. And it's a lot to overcome in one generation or one project. Yeah. So I think we're dealing with a lot of pent-up feelings and alienation from our connection to land.
That's a wonderful approach. I can certainly appreciate and understand, though, how it's not the easiest path to take, and it takes time, and you're fronting, I would assume, a lot of the research and basically the cost of doing that, but it's wonderful.
Yeah. I would say at this point, I don't... Oh, excuse me,
No, go ahead.
I would just say, at this point, I don't know how to design a project without this process.
Yeah.
Like, I actually, if you said, here is a nice piece of land, now show us your design. Yeah. I think I would freeze up and not know what to do, because I'm so dependent on the richness of its ecology and its culture. And without those things, I'm like, why don't you just pave it? I mean, I don't know. It's like, if it's not going to be meaningful, if it's not going to come from the land, then why bother? Just make it a soccer field. I don't know.
I know.
So at this point, I wouldn't know how to approach without this process.
I was wondering if you had a favorite space or park And it could be one of your guys' project, or it could be, someone
We usually
else.
ask architects their favorite building.
Yeah,
so
that's
we're shifting it slightly. If you have a favorite building, let us know. But
I am really bad at best, favorite, all of these questions, because everything to me has a qualifier.
Yeah.
Like best urban park, best wildlife preserve, best national park. But
wait, so you live in New York City?
I live in New York City and Charlottesville, Virginia. So we have 2 offices, and the number of design staff is the same in the 2 offices. So they have kind of the same heft, and I move back and forth between the 2 cities.
Gotcha.
All the time.
Well, I guess one question I would have is a bit more specific is, what's your favorite place in New York? Like it'd be a street corner, a park.
My favorite place, it's not a nice place to linger, but it's a place that tells you a tremendous amount of information about where you are. And that is on Central Park West and 78th Street. I didn't think of this until you said maybe it's a street corner. I was like, oh, there is a street corner. And 78th and Central Park West is obviously along the western edge of Central Park. And there is probably a 5-story tall extrusion of Manhattan schist that has been sliced straight down to the wall of Central Park, a sidewalk, and the street. And you look around you, and the city is pretty much flat. And you look west, and it's flat. You look east, and you're looking into a 50-foot face of rock. And you suddenly realize how ironed out and flattened Manhattan has been treated. And you feel this gigantic geology. You feel the force of Manhattan Island, the power of Manhattan Island, the scale of it. And you go into the park and you realize, Olmsted's instinct to use geology as the artistic feature, as the scale feature. He did not want, and Calvert Vaux, they did not want large buildings. Any architecture was to be, I can't remember the exact quote, but an ornament to the nature that unfolds for the visitor. So little buildings, small buildings that were kind of features of ornament, but nothing in big scale. And so this one edge of a slice into the park tells you so much about how Manhattan was formed geologically, the glory of Central Park celebrating these things, and how violent we've been at flattening out the city to accommodate what we feel we must accommodate.
That's awesome. 78th and Central Park West. I'm visiting New York. We are visiting New York soon, so I will go to that corner and stare at what you're describing.
You're going to really wonder why I said this, because it's completely mineral to a concrete sidewalk to an asphalt street. You're like, that's his favorite?
It sounds interesting, though, for sure.
It is very interesting. It is very interesting.
Thomas, thank you so much. I know you're in the middle of a site visit, in fact.
I am.
But we greatly appreciate your time. This was a wonderful conversation, and we hope to keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I would like that. I would like to mention one thing that I forgot to mention, but it really is my effort to summarize the things that we've talked about today. And in fact, the answer to your big question of how do we do this and how do we make this work? And it's a book that we just came out with this year. It's called The Land is Full. And it's published by Phaidon Publishing and their subsidiary Monticelli Press. And in that book, I try to take a really layman's language. I write an essay that's really about how we do this work, the process we go through, and it's kind of a step-by-step recipe of design. And then we have other essays by great thinkers, one dealing with the ecological history, one with cultural history. Andrea Wolf wrote the foreword to the book, the author of The Invention of Nature. And so it's capturing the last 10 years of this really fertile period for the firm, where it's 12 of our most recent public parks. So it's a completely parks book. It doesn't talk about conservation agriculture, this other thing we do, or cultural institutions, museums, and college campuses. but it does really focus on the public landscape and how this process brings life and meaning to these spaces.
That's awesome. Yeah, and we will put the link to that in the episode notes for everyone listening. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's episode. If you like this show and you want to support what we are doing, then the best way to do that is to leave a review of the podcast. You can find us on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, and also on YouTube. We don't have like a donate button. We should have a donate button.
I was going to say, the best way to support us is just send us $1 million.
Just mail us money.
And I was thinking, if I keep saying that, maybe someday it would actually happen. You never know.
We probably should set something like that up to help actually fund and support, the show. What else? You can find us on Instagram. That's the main social media platform that we are on. So give us a follow on there. You can reach out to us on all those places, including our website, which is secondstudiopod.com. The email is also hello@secondstudiopod. And we have a hotline, which is a phone number you can text or leave a voicemail at, and it is no, it's not. It's 213-222-6950. What else? What else?
I don't know. I think you probably said it all. I didn't listen. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We appreciate it a lot. More awesome guests to come, and talk soon. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.